Hey gang, thanks for coming back. This is All Things Special Cybertal. I am Cybertal. We're winding down our coverage of isolated queen pawns. We're going to do a few more review games, so sort of games that I think sort of encapsulate all the concepts that we've looked at for the past 10 or 11 videos, and then we're going to do one last episode where we sort of round up the concepts we were supposed to have drawn from all these games. We're going to first look at a couple of games to review how you're supposed to face the isolated pawn. One game I thought that sort of encapsulated all those ideas pretty well was a game of Viktor Kortschnoj versus annotated Karpov. This was in their ill-fated match in Merano in 1981. Their first two matches were far more competitive. They played in 1975 in the candidates finals. It ended up being the finals period because Fischer went crazy and defaulted and it disappeared. Very competitive. For both those matches, Karpov had a dominant early lead and then sort of collapsed towards the end, but then managed to recover and win one final game. That was the story for their match in 1978 as well. That was a true World Championship match. I believe Karpov was up 5-2. Kortschnoj managed to put the brakes on, wear Karpov out a little bit. Karpov lost 3 straight, I believe, and then managed to win one final game. Those matches were best of 6, unlimited matches. Unlimited matches existed until 1984, when Karpov and Kasparov went like 50 games without a result, and then they realized their mistake. This match in 1981 was far less competitive. Karpov won 3 of the first 4 games. At that point, Kortschnoj was in his early 50s, and Karpov was at absolute prime. That was a Karpov that was difficult for anyone to face, much less Kortschnoj sort of winding down his career at the top of world chess. This is one of the games that sort of set the tone for that match in Merano. Karpov was black, Kortschnoj was white, so c4, e6. Just a quick word on opening subtleties. This move of bishop e7 first, this sort of came into vogue as a way of preventing bishop g5. Just a small opening subtlety. Really, but the main purpose behind the subtlety on bishop e7, it's designed to prevent a certain version of the exchange variation. And here, white either has to commit to moving his knight to f3 or commit to moving his bishop to f4. Black's main fear, and I'll just slam this variation out real quick. Just leave behind the move order subtleties. Black's main fear is that white gets this version of the exchange variation, where he combines bishop g5 with the knight being on e2. This is an especially aggressive version of the exchange variation, where white still has f3 and e4 available. Whereas with his knight committed to f3, it sort of commits white to a slightly more positional version of the exchange variation. It's a small opening subtlety, but when you play at the top of world chess, those sort of opening subtleties make up the bulk of the chess that you see. So bishop e7, and then Kortschnoj plays his knight to f3, so Karpov gets what he wants and just brings his knight to f6. And now this is the mega main line of the Queen's Gambit declined. 2 main moves here for white. Rook c1 is played. e3 is the huge historical main line. I mean, this has been seen since the 1880s, 1890s. We've seen literally tens of thousands of games from this position, and there'll still be many more to come. Two main variations that I highlighted in my notes to the game. 94 is the Lasker defense. This was first formulated, of course, by Emanuel Lasker. It's a way of getting a couple of minor pieces off the board. Typically, when you're low on space, you want to trade pieces, because that's an easy way to make yourself less disadvantaged by the lack of space. It's a little bit drawish, though. If you're looking to play for a win as black, 94 makes it a little bit tough. Instead of that b6, this is the Tartakover-Makaganov-Bondarevsky, shortened the TMB. This is the Cadillac of lines. I think every world champion since Capablanca, maybe even Lasker, has played this opening as black, and several from both sides of the board. This is something like the Roy Lopez from for 1d4. This is just one of those openings that determines your class as a strong chess player by how you handle it. I give a couple of variations of this in my notes of the game, so give it a look. E3, that's the main line. Rook C1 was played. This sort of came into vogue later because white wasn't really finding much against either of those moves, so Rook C1 looks to avoid those methods. But this has its problems as well. So DXC4, it's hard to make a sweeping statement about complex theory, but I would say one of the points of DXC4 is that Rook C1 makes it make a little bit less sense for white to head to an isolated queen pawn. Because in virtually all of your isolated queen pawn structures, this rook doesn't go to C1. It just doesn't, it's a move that doesn't make a lot of sense. So black can sort of a little bit more confidently head towards those positions with the idea that white has more or less wasted a move with Rook C1. And in this game, we actually see that's more or less true. Again, it's hard to make a sweeping statement like that about opening theory, but I would say that's one of the advantages of taking on C4. So E3, C5, so we're basically heading to a Queen's Gambit accepted position with H6, Bishop H4 thrown in, and then that Rook C1 thrown in, which doesn't fit the position terribly well. CX-D4. EX-D4, it heads for the isolated pawn. Knight X-D4 might be a little bit more prudent choice. Knight X-D4 sort of accepts that Rook C1 it just doesn't fit an isolated pawn structure. So Knight X-D4 keeps things completely symmetrical, avoids any weaknesses, and then white can try to prove that his edge in mobilization and development is worth a little bit of something. I think Knight X-D4 is the slightly more practical move here. Whereas EX-D4, as we've seen, we've gone over the isolated pawn structure quite a bit, we never see this Rook C1 move. It just doesn't fit the structure. And Karpov does an excellent job of proving his trumps against the isolated pawn. So Knight C6, castle, and this is a star move. This is a move you won't often see in these structures, but it's a move to remember if you can play it. Knight H5. The note that I gave was take your equine restrictions and shove it, Tarrasch. That'll show you, long dead German guy. Of course, Tarrasch said that a knight on the rim is grim. Just like all chess sayings, they only go so far. Chess rules exist as sort of a clarifier for newer players, but the better you get at chess, the more easily you see the restrictions and the contradictions in chess, where you see the best move isn't the one that fits the sayings of chess. That's really the beauty of chess, to find the moves that don't really fit with any of what the preconceptions of what a move or game should be. It really constitutes the beauty of the game. Knight H5, it goes to the rim, but it obviously goes for this beautiful F4 square, where it sort of stares at white's queen side, or king side, and it also stares at the D5 square still. Also, we're threatening that bishop on H4, so we're looking to get a set of minor pieces off the board, and that's just one of our goals in an isolated queen pawn position like this. So Knight H5, excellent move. So bishop takes, knight takes, so we've already got one set of minor pieces off the board. It was white's dark square bishop, so it wasn't a super vital minor piece, but it's still a minor piece set nonetheless. So black has achieved something. Bishop E3, I think rook E1 is a little bit more pointful. These are all normal isolated queen pawn moves. The advantage here for white is that on a poorly timed B6, white can respond with queen F3 and try to embarrass that. Whereas bishop E3, we don't know yet if bishop E3 is mandatory. So play the moves that really fit with your structure the most first, and then move on to other moves after that. So knight F6, black's managed to get D5 perfectly blockaded, so that's not blockaded but controlled, so that's a huge gain for black. Knight E5, bishop D7. So now he's going to easily solve the problem of his light square bishop. That light square bishop's going to go to C6. White really needs to feel the danger of the position here. He needs to realize that he doesn't have a good isolated queen pawn here. Black is nearly fully mobilized. After bishop C6, it'll be too late to do anything about his isolated pawn. So this is really a chance for white to liquidate. White played queen E2. This just doesn't sense the danger for himself in the position. He should probably play D5. The bishop moving to D7 open an opportunity to liquidate this isolated pawn. In my opinion, he should take it and just head for a dead drawing position. sometimes it's okay to admit that your opening didn't work out and bail out into a drawn position. Whereas queen e2, rook c8. So after queen e2, we can black can spend the time to play rook c8 because there's no more threat of d5. Knight e4 is just another basic mistake. It's not necessarily losing just yet, but it's exactly the opposite of what white wants to be doing. When you have an isolated pawn, don't trade minor pieces. You just don't. Rook fe1 would be much better. It holds serve. It forces black to keep the ball rolling. You know, I think black's... It might be even here, maybe a little bit better for black. But after knight e4, black is just simply better, because now we've got 2 sets of minor pieces up the board, soon to be 3. Knight e4, bishop c6. Now we've got 3 sets of minor pieces off the board, and that pawn on d4 is just as weak. And white doesn't have any compensatory factors to make up for that weakness. Rook c3, that's another basic error. In my opinion, getting more pieces mobilized is a much better idea. Queen d6, rook d8, so just starting to load up on the d-pawn. Rook b6, so that it pins the bishop on b3 in place for now. Then the pawn on b2 would be weak, so moving the bishop really isn't possible. Queen e1, that's another poor move. It's a little bit passive. It's strange that Kortschnoj played this game so incredibly passive. He should have played something like h4, and here one example variation is... And this is still a tough fight. You know, white can move his kingside pawns for it. He can get something like h5 and g4 going. This is still a fight. Whereas after queen e1, it doesn't even try to generate kingside counterplay. White needs to get his pawns moving on the kingside and try to generate play against black's king. Never defend passively if you have to. You see later in the game that both sides sort of get lined up on this d-pawn. And that's white just arranging his pieces incredibly passively. Don't do that if you don't have to. Generate counterplay. Defend actively. Create threats of your own. Never defend passively. If you defend passively, you're just going to get forced back in your trenches and you're going to consistently lose every game. Or most every game. So queen e1 is just way too passive. Queen d7. It's instructive to see how calm Karpov did this. Now he's got rook d6 ready, and he's just going to suddenly be tripled up on that weak d-pawn, which is exactly how you want to arrange your major pieces against an isolated d-pawn. And their rook d6. Queen c6, offering to trade queens here would be completely losing for white to do so. Black would just win the pawn and shouldn't have a hard time converting. Knight d5, knight goes to the ideal square. And again, Kortschnoj just played this game so passive. Don't trade pieces in an isolated queen pawn position. Just don't. Keep as much material on the board as you can. Even if that knight looks great, he should play a3. Just this light square bishop has value. He can generate an attack with it later somehow. Just trading down is just incredibly compliant. It leaves white in a position with no counterplay whatsoever. So this is as close to the ideal position against an isolated pawn as you can, where nothing but major pieces on the board. You know, black's already got the positional threat of e5 because that unleashes the pin on the d-file. This is a tough position for white to defend. He probably can't defend it. This is probably a technical win for black. But it's a position with no counterplay whatsoever for white. Black's going to be doing all the fun attacking on that weak pawn in d4. Rook b3. Queen c3. That misplaces that rook even more. Now it's trapped on b3. You should just continue the shuffling. 4. Queen d2, it allows the rook to come back into the game. This way, after b5, now he's threatening a5 and pushing the rook back even more. Takes queen a3. This should get refuted specifically and concretely. Queen c2 is better because it allows him to keep his pieces a bit more connected. Queen a3 just disconnects all of his pieces. Rook xe4. And now queen b5 is a mistake. Rook c8 is absolutely superior because you're grabbing that open c-file suddenly. And after rook xe5, rook xd4. This is similar to a position we get later in the game. In these major piece endings, what usually happens is the winning side is the one with more activity that breaks through to the undercarriage of the position and attacks the enemy king. In major piece endings, especially queen and rook, king's safety is number one on the list. The winning side is the one that usually breaks through and gets some decisive series of checks. And here, black's activity is such that he's going to break through to white's king, either checkmate or extract some decisive concession. So queen b5, it looks nice and it doesn't fundamentally change the position, but black has something better. Rook d2, queen a1 would be best. When you're defending, keep all your pieces connected. This queen is now reconnected with both those rooks. Those rooks are connected to the d4 pawn. Just keep your pieces as connected as possible. Don't keep your pieces disconnected. Rook d2, e5. So this is taking advantage of that d-file pin. Suddenly this is completely decisive for black. He's exploiting that d-file pin. He's just going to exploit his superior activity. Rook takes c5. Queen a1, this is a bit too late. I give a variation after rook f2. Black can just play very simple chess with rook f5. This just... White has one piece in the game, which is the rook and f2. Once that's traded off, his two remaining pieces are stranded on the a-file. You can see here, black's even temporarily down a pawn, but it doesn't matter. The material's even, but this is decisive for black just because of his activity. Rook at d2. The queen's covering the check on this diagonal. There's no attack for white. Then h2 is going to fall, and black has a decisive attack. This is how these positions usually end up with major piece endings. One side gets a decisive attack. This isn't a tactical accident. You go back to this position. Look how active black's pieces are, and look how passive white's pieces are. That is why that's how you get a position like this. You know, getting that attack from this position is not just an accident of the position. When you arrange your pieces aggressively and force the other side to defend, you will convert into a position like that. That's what having your pieces and aggressive pieces leads to. It's not just aggression against the point you're initially arranged at. Once you have active poses for your pieces, they can achieve a lot, not just what you initially set out to do. And once your pieces are passively defending, it's hard for them to redeploy somewhere else. If a piece is passive, it's usually just generally passive, not specifically passive to one task. So getting a position like this is not a tactical accident. It's a complete logical outgrowth of forcing white's pieces to be passive in a position like this. So e5, this isn't a tactical accident. This is just part of the position. If you defend passively, you'll get beaten just like this every time. Queen a1, queen e8. So this is a very clever long move, just reconnecting all of his pieces. He's threatening rook e1, so now taking his force. And again, white's even temporarily up a pawn here. But it doesn't matter because black's pieces are so active. Queen c6. Now just threatening queen g2 mate, and white does not have a good response. And none of this is a tactical accident. This is exactly what you get when you have your pieces become so active. Queen c5, and then just a normal staircase method. Easiest would be this. Queen d5 is where Kortschnoj resigned, but the remaining variation would be this. Winning the white queen, and then that queen versus rook at the end is just completely trivial to win with the amount of pawns on the board. So really, the key to the position was much earlier. So knight h5 sort of begins the process of winning for black. When you're playing against the isolated pawn, trade off minor pieces. This knight h5, it looks a little bit weird because it's going to the edge of the board, but it maintains its eye on that key d5 square. But it's looking also to trade off minor pieces. When you're fighting against the isolated pawn, trade off minor pieces. So in this position, black's already got one set of minor pieces off the board. He's locking down on d5. This is already a pretty decent position for black. And then white plays a little bit loosey from here. This is where white should bail out with d5. Just admit that his opening hasn't worked out. After this position, this is basically a dream against the isolated pawn. Both sides, you've managed to get two sets of minor pieces off the board. White has no kingside activity just yet for that isolated pawn. There's no kingside attack forthcoming just yet at all. This is a dream against the isolated pawn. This is exactly what you want. And then the way Karpov converted, I just want to sort of re-emphasize this maneuver here. How he got first doubled on the d-file, and then tripled on the d-file. This is exactly what you want to do against the isolated pawn. Keep all your major pieces on the board, trade off the minor pieces to reduce white's attacking chances, and then triple up on the d file if you can to bombard that isolated pawn. That's exactly what you want to do every time. So this was absolutely the perfect technique from Karpov, and Kortschnoj just very logically collapsed after this, because Black's advantage here is overwhelming. It's nearly impossible to defend a position like this. So, dream game from Karpov. Kortschnoj just didn't resist properly. He was very compliant in a position like this, but Karpov had the sort of technique that made Kortschnoj's resistance look worse than it really was. So, model game, give it a look. I'll have the notes in the annotated game and the notes as usual. My name's John, and I'll check you later.